All right, welcome back, everyone. So this is kind of the last couple lectures for my History 165 class, History of the Middle East. We're going to cover Afghanistan and the road to 9/11. I'd love it to be a happier topic. It is a bit of a somber topic, of course, especially considering when I'm re-recording this. This is a lecture I'd done before, and now I'm updating it as well because of more current events, and the whole cycle of where we started. And of course, and as the time I'm recording this in 2022, Afghanistan fell again after American troops were withdrawn. So we're going to cover the whole array of events. Obviously, for anybody else listening, this is going to be kind of a general overview. I'm not going to go into every single detail of what happened between like the 1800s and 2022, but it should give you a nice overall picture in a couple of short lectures here, hopefully to kind of understand events that led to 9/11 and this very, somber picture of this plane crashing into the buildings in that horrible day that a lot of us, of course, remember. I realize for a lot of my students, of course, many of them weren't even born when this all took place, which makes it that much more important to study and learn about. So where do we start from? Well, we'll start from over here, just a little bit of early history, of course. When you look at our map, of course, you see Afghanistan here. And Afghanistan, this piece of real estate, it was not really ever a strong, unified nation. Very often it was controlled under the powers like the Mongols and the Safavids. And we get into like the 1800s, and around the 1800s, you get the colonization period. And the first major power that kind of tries to move into Afghanistan and control it will be the British. So I'm going to start with the British, and we'll talk about the Soviets, and then we'll talk about the Taliban and America and all of those things that play a role, these different entities that move in and try to have influence in Afghanistan for one reason or another. So we go here with the British, and the British start with what we call the British-Afghan Wars in the late 1800s. Now you go, why did the British want Afghanistan? Well, remember at the time, when you're looking at this map, at the time, there was no Pakistan, right? India and Pakistan were one nation. And up here you have Russia. I know it's the Soviet Union, but because this is a later map. But here you'd have Russia, here you'd have India, and right over here you have Afghanistan. And this is a piece of real estate that India was controlled by the British. The British had India for a while now. They controlled it. And I think at least a large part of the motivation of the British moving into Afghanistan was to create kind of a buffer zone from the Russians moving into that area. So that's one of the motivations that they had going there. The fighting in this British-Afghan war was difficult, the terrain was difficult, but eventually we get to about 1880, and the British do what they often did when they colonized, which is they tried to work with the local people there to try to give them some self-autonomy and say, okay, well, you're under British control, but you can run your own day-to-day lives and, run your own local administration. And they did this with the emirs there, specifically in 1880, a man named Abdul Rahman Khan. They basically agreed to let him kind of run the day-to-day affairs, and he would agree to kind of serve British interests and make sure that, he would protect British interest in India in case Russia tried anything, that kind of idea. This is all part of the 19th century colonization period. Different countries colonized differently. In my History 111 class, I go into a little bit more detail on all of this. So that was the initial agreement after a bit of fighting in the area that the British put in this man, Abdul Rahman Khan. And for, you could see there about 20 years, things went okay. After that, he had a son named Habubullah Khan, and that continued relatively smoothly as well, actually, for the British. But then when we get to about 1919, we get to Amnullah Khan, and things kind of transform a bit. Instead of agreements and working together on building projects and roads and those kind of things, Amnullah Khan, Amnullah Khan was like, yeah, I don't want the British here. I don't want them here. I don't want obviously anybody else there. I want Afghanistan and I want to control it for ourselves. We don't need anybody here. And he really didn't want to serve the British interest. And at even one point was threatening India. I don't think realistically he could have done much to move into India. Of course, the British are going to control India all the way until 1947, if you're not familiar with that, until after World War II. So meanwhile, it's about 1918, 1919. Of course, World War I has just ended. A lot of resources are being spent on World War I. And by 1919, when we start to see this period of time shifting to Amnullah Khan, the British were like, we've been here for a long time. It's not worth the resources. and you're going to eventually get the British to say, you know, we wash our hands of this and we're going to leave. And so the British are going to kind of cut their losses and end up leaving. But they end up leaving a bit of a power vacuum in the region that's going to open up the door a little bit later for the Russians to come in. So there wasn't a lot of development there. I mean, just to give you a couple ideas, you know, in terms of modernizing and developing in Afghanistan, you're not going to have radio broadcast there till the 1940s and television broadcast there till the 1970s. And so it's a long time until they don't really modernize very well. And the area is, again, vulnerable. It's still very often divided up into more individual rulers. There isn't one solid ruler, and that opens up the door, especially after the British leave, to the Soviets. So now we kind of jump ahead a bit to the 1970s and we talk about how the Soviet Union moved into Afghanistan, and this really sets things in motion to eventually seeing the rise of the Taliban and Al-Qaeda and so forth. So let's talk about that a bit. So the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, what basically starts to happen in the 1970s is the Soviet Union says, well, we're going to move into Afghanistan. This was something that obviously the United States didn't like. There's a really good movie called Charlie Wilson's War. It's based on a real guy named Charlie Wilson. Charlie Wilson was a congressman from Texas. He lived 1933 to 2010. And so they did this movie about him. And this movie was a bit about how the United States, through the CIA, I'll give you a little bit more detail here in a second about it, were trying to help the people in Afghanistan fight against the Soviet Union, right? So the Soviet Union moved in. Now, when the British were in Afghanistan, obviously it wasn't a good situation. When the Soviets moved into Afghanistan, it just moved to a whole level of brutality. The Soviet Union, you know, they treated the people there horribly. There are going to be millions of people who are going to be injured and killed in the fighting, millions of refugees. Because obviously the Afghan people didn't want the Soviets there as well. And, you know, just to give you one idea of the way the Soviets would fight against the people in Afghanistan, is they would create these mines, landmines, but they were shaped like toys. And they were shaped like toys that the kids would go and look at them and play with them, and then they might blow up. And they were designed actually not to kill. They were designed just to maim. To do damage. Why? Because they figured, well, if a child gets hurt, then a parent has to watch a child, and then the parent can't fight the Soviet Union, right? So the United States was concerned about the Soviet Union there for a few reasons. They were concerned about, you know, obviously the spread of communism. This is during the Cold War, and this whole idea of containment. So for some people, they were motivated by that. Other people were motivated from a clear moral cause. They generally believed that the people in Afghanistan were treated horribly by the Soviet Union. For some people, the motivation was about drug trade, actually. Believe it or not, there's a big opium trade that was coming out of Afghanistan. That concerned some people. So there was more, as many times in history, more than one motivation of why the United States wanted to help the people in Afghanistan fight against the Soviet Union. So this guy, Charlie Wilson, he was a congressman, and he was a big part of trying to help the Mujahideen. The Mujahideen, as you can see here, this other key term, they were the people in Afghanistan trying to fight the Soviet Union. So he goes to this guy named Doc Long. Doc Long was another politician in the United States with a lot of connections with finances. And long story short, and the movie does a good job going into more detail on this if you want to watch it, convinces him through some subversion of going through the CIA and Pakistan to give weapons to Afghanistan to fight against the Soviet Union. And a lot of this was done kind of very quietly and secretly. A lot of the concern was, well, we don't want to give weapons directly to Afghanistan, so we'll go to Pakistan and then to Afghanistan. And it helped, but it really didn't do enough to push the Soviets out. Eventually, this goes all the way to when Ronald Reagan was president. Ronald Reagan knows about this, and they begin to authorize not just sending small arms, but to start sending Stinger missiles to Afghanistan. Now, the Stinger missiles, if you don't know what those are used for, well, those are basically used to shoot down helicopters, these Soviet helicopters. And once we started to give them the Stinger missiles, that really started to change the tide of the war and the fighting there. The Soviet Union was starting to suffer heavy casualties. The Soviet Union, of course, has got a lot on their hands with all of Eastern Europe still that they're trying to dominate and control. And eventually we get to the point where in the 1980s, the Soviet Union decides this isn't for us anymore. And in the 1980s, the Soviet Union pulls out. There are many people who study the Cold War and talk about how this was one of the reasons why the Soviet Union collapsed. They spent a lot of resources, time, and money in this piece of real estate and then ended up leaving with really nothing. But of course, when the Soviet Union left, and this is really explained well in that movie, Charlie Wilson's War, when the Soviet Union left, they left, we kind of also left the power vacuum there too. We got the Soviet Union out, and like, yay, we got the Soviet Union out, and we kind of washed our hands of things, leaving the power vacuum there, which is then going to be filled by, as we move into the 1990s and early 2000s, the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. So really interesting storyline here. If you do watch the movie Charlie Wilson's War, there's also kind of a part on this where all of this almost never happened because Charlie Wilson was apparently involved with some cocaine and Playboy models, and he was going to be ousted from office, but this kind of apparently all happened outside U.S. Territories, and therefore it was all kind of pushed aside, and he was actually able to do it. He's a colorful, cool character, so if you watch that movie, you'll kind of get a sense of that. So then the next story, of course, is what happens when the Soviet Union leaves, and then that opens the door, as I said, to the Taliban and so forth. So anyways, that's a little bit of where we are. We'll go into more detail further in the next lecture in terms of what happens. All right, thank you, everyone.